A Treatise of Satan's Temptations. Part 2. By Richard Gilpin. A Discourse of the Malice, Power, Cruelty and Diligence of Satan. Chapter 2 Part 6. Of the advantages which Satan hath, and useth, for the introduction of error and more. Nay, the will, though in things purely speculative, it may retain its averseness, as also in things practical, while they are considered only as what may be done, before the understanding hath come up to its final resolve, determining that such things must or ought to be done, cannot but follow the light and information of the understanding, and that according to the proportion of its conviction. So that though in some cases, a man would have things otherwise than he believes them to be, yet he cannot believe what he will, neither can he refuse to will what is certainly represented, to be good and necessary. Tantum quisque vult, quantum intelligit se vel debere. Notwithstanding all this, the forementioned particulars may so bias the mind, that it shall not act truly and steadily, as we may see in these three particulars. 1. First, in things clearly demonstrated to the understanding, though the will cannot directly oppose, nor prevail to have them judged false, yet it can indirectly hinder the procedure of the understanding, and divert it from fixing its consideration upon the truth, or from working itself into positive determinations, for bringing it into practice. Intellectus sequitur voluntatem quo ad exercitium, non quo ad specificationem. Thus many that cannot but believe there is a God, and that his law is true, being biased by their lusts, the power of pleasures or interest, etc., do prevail upon their understandings, to take up other objects of consideration, so that they are said to forget God, and to cast his commandments behind their backs, as also not to remember their latter end. Though they cannot, but believe that they shall die. Truth may be imprisoned and fettered, where it cannot be slain. We read of holding the truth in unrighteousness, Romans 1:18. Which was this, that those heathens of whom the Apostle speaks, by reason of their vicious inclinations and practices, though they could not obliterate those notices of equity and religion, that were imprinted on their minds, yet they kept them at under, as captives in a dungeon, and suffered them not to rise up, in a just practical improvement. Now the wrong that is done to truth, this way is not only by rendering it unfruitful and useless at present, but hereby the devil hath his advantage, in the gaining of time to gather together more forces against that truth, and by frequent onsets of contrary arguings, especially upon the advantage of the mind's indifferency and remissness, begot by long and often diversions, to set another face upon it, and by degrees, to overturn former persuasions. This was the very case of the heathens in the place last cited, who being first swayed by their impieties, became unwilling to give way to those dictates of light and justice which they had, and having thus gratified their lusts, the devil further prevailing with them, to find evasions from the power of those truths, they began to make unsuitable inferences from these premises, which they could not deny, and so became sottish and vain in their reasonings, changing the glory of the uncorruptible God, into an image made like unto corruptible man, and by such practices against truth, they at last changed the truth into a lie, verse 25. And at long run obliterated the knowledge of God, out of their minds. This is Satan's old method of overturning truth at last, by diverting the mind, from receiving the present powerful impressions of those principles. 2. Secondly, but in things doubtful, where there is not a clear certainty what is truth, but contrary opinions strive with such equal confidence, that it is difficult to determine which hath the conquest. There the mind may be so swayed by its bias, that it may give approbation to error, nay, where, upon a fair and indifferent trial, truth hath the greater appearance of strength, and error nothing else than little shadows, or appearances of reason to shelter itself under. Yet that way may the mind be inclined by the aforesaid things. We have a more easy and facile belief, for what we would have than for what we would not. Though there is nothing more noted by common experience than this, that men are usually drawn aside by humors, inclinations, interests, and education, to judge well of that which an unprejudiced person would easily see to be weak, unjust, ridiculous, or unreasonable. Yet how these considerations and tempers do exert their force upon the understanding to draw it into a compliance! Or by what secret art they can heighten probabilities, and lessen objections, or by what insensible progress they move, that men thus carried do not perceive, that they are under such a is not so very discernible. How often may we observe men, that are rational enough to discover the pitiful shifts and poor allegations of others, with such gravity and confidence, where their own interests are concerned, to offer such low reasonings and extravagant impertinences, that all that hear them are ready to laugh at their folly. And yet they themselves entertain no less than persuasions, of the invincibleness of their arguings. They so eagerly desire what they would establish, that they think anything is enough to justify it, and are apt to imagine that their shifts and excuses, appear as strong to others as to themselves. I have known some that, by the sway of interest, have changed their opinions in religious matters, and have really become otherwise persuaded than they had been formerly. And not as some who, for advantage, will knowingly take up what they cannot believe to be true, and have not been able to say that they have met with new arguments or new answers to objections. But I know not how arguments, which they had contemned, and laid by for weak, began to look big upon them. The arguments by which their former persuasion was upheld, grew insensibly feeble in their hands. The one revived, gathered strength, after they had a little cherished them, by thinking there might be something in them, though before they knew all the particulars, and could not instance in anything, which they had not formally notified and answered. And the other sort of arguments grew weaker and weaker, till at last they parted with all good conceit of them. So that such a change was but as the turning of the tables. That which acted behind the curtain, and wrought this change of the fancy, could be no other, than some of the forementioned things that biassed their mind. For where the arguments, pro and con, were the same, the alteration of opinion, where men are not so wicked as to go directly against their own light, must of necessity be imputed to the different positions of external things, and the different humors and inclinations begot by them, even as the different stations of men, in the prospect of some pictures represent them variously. One way they give the shape of a beautiful face, another way they express the ugly deformity of a devil, or as different reflections of the sunbeams upon the same object clothed with several colors. The Scripture doth also give us notice of this advantage which the devil takes from the inclinations of men, to lead them into mistakes. That of Micah 2:11, If a man, walking in the spirit of falsehood, do lie, saying, I will prophesy unto thee of wine and of strong drink, he shall even be the prophet of this people, hath this for its foundation, that, let the error be never so gross and palpable, as if a man should prophesy a liberty for drunkenness. If it be suitable to the sway of people's humors, it will readily enough be embraced. He shall be a prophet to this people, that is, such a prophet will easily prevail with such a people. Their vicious inclinations fit them for any impression of a suitable error. The Apostle Paul also found this too true, in the heresies of his own times. For he tells us that seducers had learned that cunning from the devil to draw men to error by the sway of their lusts. 2 Timothy 3:6, they creep into houses, and lead captive silly women laden with sins, and led away with divers lusts, as also 2 Timothy 4:6, he prophesies of the future use of this stratagem. After their own lusts, shall they heap to themselves teachers. So that the usual prevalency of error was and is, from the underground working of lusts, humors, habits, and inclinations, which make men willing to entertain an opinion, which can but gratify them with a suitableness or fitness. 3. Thirdly, where the forementioned particulars of inclination, natural or acquired humors, custom, education, etc., do neither divert the understanding, nor engage it to close with error, yet often do they discover how powerfully they can bias the mind. In that, these prevail with men, to modify and mold a truth, according to the bent or form of their inclinations. Thanks.